All right. Now, guys, we're on 10A2. And what we're doing is we're doing the statement of the Mishnah that states, if I caused a portion of his damage, I'm obligated in the payment of his damage, like one who caused all his damage. Havshati b'miktzat nizkor. So that means if I caused a portion of his damage, I'm obligated in the payment of his damage, like one who's caused all his damage. I'm saying that because just like we have the statement, kivlei, but the rabamine, you're going to come to learn the statement as well. We're going to obviously do a bit of vocab. Now, I'm going to just set the scene here. The law says if I caused a portion of his damage, I'm obligated in the payment of his damage, like one who caused all his damage. So it brings a case if one digs a pit, 9 tefach deep, and another person comes and completes it to a depth of 10 tefachim, the last person is exclusively liable for any death or injury caused by the pit. Now, I don't know if you remember in the 6th daf when we started to deal with this. Do any of you remember this? It was actually addressed.
Yes.
Yeah, so it was touched there in terms of public nuisance, but it was actually, I apologize, guys, the exact version when it discusses a 9 tefach pit or 10 tefach. My note says it's in the 3rd daf A. It's in 3A, so you can go there to refer to it. So, in other words, anything 10 tefach or more is capable legally of causing death. Anything that's 9 tefach or below is capable of causing injury. So that if an animal does die on the 8 tefach pit, for example, you're responsible for the injury portion and not the death portion. So what's it saying in this note? The first guy comes in, he digs a pit 9 tefach deep. And the second guy completes it to a depth of 10 tefach. And the last person now is exclusively liable for any death or injury caused by the pit. Now, I just want you to bear in mind the wording here. It says death or injury. So this is going to be the discussion in the Gemara. So the Mishnah has the same view. The Tana Kamma has the same view of the Mishnah. And the Tana Kamma is obviously one of the groups of Tanaim. I don't know if it was like Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai, where it started with Hillel and Shammai and then became a group of people, or the Tana Kamma is one person. I'm not sure, guys. I have to look it up. But the Tana Kamma echoes the exact view of the Mishnah, which means whether it causes death or injury, if you complete the pit, you're exclusively liable. So the injured party basically may go after the last digger to receive compensation for the animal's death. Okay. Now, one thing that I just want to reiterate is that this is brought in much more detail in Bava Kamma in 51a. So it derives from a scriptural verse that the action of the second digger causes the first digger to become entirely exempt from liability. What we're doing here in this daf is we're touching on the issue. Just remember that this particular first chapter, Abba Avos, introduces all the topics that are going to be enfolded in the 9 other chapters. Does that make sense? So it introduces on 51a the fact that the second digger causes the first digger to become entirely exempt from liability. Okay, now, one thing I wanted to just let you know, that Tosfot has a bit of a different discussion to Rashi, because Rashi agrees with the Meiri, and we're going to see what this is now. According to Tosfot, the second digger exemption of the first only is when the former creates a legal pit. If, however, the first party has dug 8 tefachim and the second party increased the depth to only 9, both diggers will be liable for injury. Now, because Tosfot actually goes according to the opinion of Rebbe, and so does Rabbeinu Yonasan. So we're going to go through here the claim. So the dead animal's owner has no claim against the first digger for the pit he created because it lacks the capacity for killing. So Meiri and Rashi turn around and say, even if it's for injury, only the second digger is responsible. Okay. So let's just go. We're going on 10.8.3. So it ends off, and he may go after this, both diggers to be compensated for any injuries. Our Mishnah held, however, that the second digger is only obligated for injuries. So let me just put this in very, very simple Damon language. You have the Bava Kamma, which agrees with the Mishnah. And the Mishnah and the Bava Kamma both say that whether or not it's injury or death, the second digger is completely liable for finishing off the pit. Rebbe says that in a case of death, the second digger is fully responsible because he creates an injurious pit to a lethal one, but he does not agree in terms of injury. Okay? Now, the Gemara wants to cite an Amora who reconciles Rebbe's opinion with the Mishnah. So it brings in Rav Papa, who said, our Mishnah, which teaches that one who causes a portion of the damage is regarded as having caused all the damage, speaks of only where a second digger is obligated to pay completely for an animal's death. And this is the opinion on everybody. So again, Rebbe and the rabbis all agree that if it creates death, the second digger that completes it to a lethal pit is responsible. Where they disagree is the Bava Kamma agrees with the Mishnah that for injury, the second digger is responsible, but Rebbe says they share the costs. Now, let me just go to an opinion according to the Choshen Mishpat. It's on page 410. It's on note 13, okay? So this is what the Choshen Mishpat says. Now this gets even more specific, which I agree with, by the way. Each digger pays according to the amount he dug when he wreaks havoc for injury. In other words, what it's saying is this. A pit that causes injury is up to 9 tefach. So if the person creates, say he owes 9,000 rand for the pit, right? And in terms of damage to the animal, for the cow. If he created a pit 7 tefach deep, and the second digger creates a pit of 2 tefach deep, the first digger, according to the Choshen Mishpat, would have to pay 7 grand. The second digger would have to pay what, guys?
2 grand.
2 grand, exactly. So to me, that makes sense. But this does not follow the view of the Bava Kamma nor the Mishnah. It doesn't discern between injury and death. So what Rav Papa actually comes to say is, he says, listen, you can reconcile it because they all agree in terms of death. The whole discussion is regarding the argument of injury. All right, just let me, okay. Now, Rav Papa was actually a Tana. I don't know why it says here, and a Moira who reconciles Rebbe's opinion with the Mishnah. Anyway, there might be more than one Rav Papa. An objection is raised. So I don't know if you know, there's two, okay, I see what it says here. So the Amora that they're actually referring to is actually Rav Zera and Rav Sheshet. Rav Papa is a Tana. So Rav Zera is saying that, listen, this is a case of a pit, but you can apply this to another damager. So what's the instance that they have? Say you've got an ox, right? And that ox, you've given it to 4 custodians to look after, and another custodian, you thought it's a good idea that the other custodian looks after it. So in total, how many custodians do you have? Guys, you've got 5. Because you figure just for good measure, you'd have 5 custodians. And you delivered the ox to look after the 5 custodians for safekeeping. And basically Rav Zera turns around and says, and one of them was negligent in watching the animal, and the animal subsequently did damage. In which case, the negligent custodian, who was but one of the 5, is responsible for the animal, should nonetheless be fully and exclusively liable for the damage. Why did the Bryson not mention this instance as well? So basically, what Rav Zera was actually coming to say is this is not a case of a Tanaic dispute. He's bringing entirely his own opinion. He'd say, okay, let's take a case of ox. It's a damage luck pit. There are 5 people to look after it. The 5th one didn't look after it, and the ox then did damage. So he's fully responsible. So why did the Bryson not mention this case at all? Does anybody have any suggestions?
What not mention the case about with the 5 people?
Yes. Guys, are you with me?
5 custodians.
Yeah, but the 5 custodians, it's not with the first example.
Yes.
The one guy's extending it. He's exacerbating the problem.
No, he's not exacerbating. That would mean exaggerating the problem. He's not. It's he's choosing a case as similar as possible. So
no. I'm saying in the first case, where the digger, when he makes it from 7 tests, whatever, to 9 or to 10, he is exacerbating the problem. He's increasing the problem. So he's paying for that amount. Whereby with the 5 guys, theoretically they're all responsible. I mean, I don't understand how one can only be negligent. If all 5 are watching, all 5 should be responsible.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
I mean, what were the other 4 guys doing while this guy was being negligent?
Okay, so that's a very, very good question. Michael, can you hear the question? Michael?
I can hear.
Okay. So the question itself, Gavin, is a good one. So this is what the Gemara actually wants to say. It wants to say, listen, the case of Rav Zera wasn't mentioned in the Gemara, in the actual Tanaic issue, because he wasn't a Moira, same as Rav Sheshes. Rav Papa was a Tana, and so was Rebbe, as well as the Tana Kamma. Are you with me? So that's one reason why it wasn't mentioned. The other reason is it wasn't quite the same. Because let me explain to you what it's saying. If you say without the participation of the negligent custodian, okay, so you've got 5, and the 5th one failed to safeguard the ox, right? Gav?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, sorry guys, I can't hear if you can hear. Apologies.
Yeah.
But listen,
No, you can.
There's 5 people guarding the ox. It was the 5th one that was negligent. Now, the reason is that if the ox could be safeguarded without the 5th one, say you needed 5 people to keep the ox restrained. Now, the one that let go of the restraint or went AWOL or didn't look after it properly, he's the reason why it wasn't controlled. So therefore, he in essence solely caused it. But if it could have been controlled with four people, why is the 5th person responsible? Because it could have been controlled without him. What damage did he cause? That's why the case is quite analogous. Do you see, Gavin?
Yeah.
In other words, there's only 2 possibilities. If it takes 5 people to look after it, the one that actually allowed the ox to do the damage because he didn't hold it with his full capacity or he just lost interest or whatever, it took 5 people to look after it. The 5th guy actually didn't use his strength and his ingenuity. Therefore, 4 people couldn't control it. Therefore, the 5th one is responsible. So therefore, he caused the damage. Then, in a case where you say, well, even without him, the ox could have been safeguarded because it only required 4. Okay, yes, he went AWOL. But then, what damage did he cause? Because 4 people could have controlled it. That was the Gemara's rebuttal to Rav Zera. That's why they say it's not analogous. Let me tell you why. Because look at the case of a pit. In the case of a pit, the second digger actually only caused a portion of the damage. Why? Because the first digger actually started creating the pit. He's a co-creator. In other words, if you created 9 amos and the guy created 10 amos, right? If he just created 1 other amos on his own, he wouldn't have been responsible because it would have been a 1 amma pit. So the first guy did create the majority portion. The second guy only created a small portion. And this is what the Mishnah is coming to say. If you create a small portion, you're responsible as though you created the whole portion. Does that make sense? And why do you need the Mishnah to state this? Is because it's not obvious. You would say, listen, without the first guy, the second guy couldn't have created a lethal pit. So in other words, it took his contribution. It would have been a one tefach pit. So in that particular case, the first person should also be responsible. So you needed a specific edict in the Mishnah to mention that the first person is not responsible. We're going to see why.
Can I add a comment quickly? It's very relevant.
Of course.
So to me, the last guy is the one responsible to guard that pit, not the first guy. He's no longer involved. So the last guy should be fully responsible because he's the one who added an extra 3 meters. He finished that pit. It's up to him to guard it, to make sure it's not in harm's way.
Yes, exactly.
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure, Ken.
Shouldn't they, if they were all from the outset originally responsible, but maybe even though the fifth guy may have dug the extra tefach, they're all still responsible. So they still have some form of responsibility, and they can't jointly and severally liable.
Are you talking about the ox or the pit or both?
You're talking about both.
Either the five custodians.
The guys watching the.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So listen, on your
Maybe.
particular note, you've got a good point because the Rambam agrees with you. You're in good company. Rashi and Meiri don't agree with you because they basically say, according to logic, if the first four were capable of controlling the ox and failed to do so, what difference did the first person make? But the Rambam agrees with you, Kevin. He said, listen, in this case, all 5 custodians pay equally. Why? And the Ravad agrees with the Rambam. Why? Because the 5th one went AWOL, it says, and the first 4 were negligent in handling the ox, meaning they didn't stop the 5th one from walking off, and they were also partly to blame. In other words, if they couldn't control the ox, if they couldn't control the ox at all and it took the 5th person, there's no question the 5th one's responsible. But if they could and the 5th one went AWOL, you're responsible for the 5th one going AWOL because he still shirked his responsibilities. But the 4 are still responsible because it took only 4 people to be capable of looking after the ox.
Like a bank robbery, if there's a getaway car, the driver's as responsible as the person who held the teller up. He's also liable.
Yeah, but the only difference is here they talk about a case where they're discerning in terms of the case where the 4 people had the capacity to control the ox and they didn't. In that case, the 4 are responsible and the 5th, according to the Rambam, is for going AWOL, meaning he just died. He left. So then, even though it could have been looked after without him, if the 4 could have controlled the ox better, because it only took 4 people, he's still responsible, according to the Rambam, for going AWOL, even though it didn't need him. Okay? But in a case where it took all 5 people, and the 5th one basically was the one that never controlled him, the 5th one is responsible in total.
Jointly and severally?
No, only because... Not jointly and severally. Jointly and severally means they're all responsible. And in part, meaning it's not the case here. Do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, if the 5th one, if it needed all 5, and the 4 were doing their duty, and the 5th one did it, they don't all pay equally.
Then they're not liable, the 4 only his.
Yeah, but they're talking in the case where it only took 4 to look after, but the 5th one just went AWOL and ducked. In other words, if the 5th one hadn't left, he could have stepped in quickly. So the Rambam says that they're all responsible. But Rashi and Meiri said that, listen, it's a simple case. There's either 5 people you need or 4. If you 4 people, the 5th person didn't do anything by not contributing because it only took 4 to look after. He might have failed to do what he had to do, but he's not financially responsible because it didn't take a 5th person's effort. And if you want to say it took 5 people, then the one that didn't hold to his responsibility and control the ox, whoever was the weakest in that link pays for all. Because without the 5th person being the weak link in the chain, the ox would have been found. Okay? So he's saying that this is exactly why the case is not the same as the pit. Why? Because with the pit, as Gavin quite rightly said, is that, the first one did contribute to the pit in terms of the lethal aspect, for sure. You know, a pit that if the second one only dug 2 tefach or 3 or whatever, but the first one did the first contributing part to make it injurious, and the second one made it lethal, The question is, Rebbe says, if they both created injury, then they're both responsible. But if it's death, only the second one. Because the first one didn't create a pit worthy of being lethal. And the reason why it's not the same case as Rav Zera is because they didn't all contribute to the damage. Either the fifth one was the weak link in the chain and therefore he's responsible, or it only took four people to look after it, in which case the four are responsible. And you don't need the fifth one to obligate him. Does that make sense? The cases are not analogous because in the case of the pit, both contribute to digging the pit, both. So now it's a chiddush to say that only the second one is responsible for death. We would have thought, just like we would have thought that they're both responsible. And it's even more of a chiddush to say that only the second one is responsible for injury, according to the Tana Kamma and the Mishnah. Because we wouldn't have thought it. We said, listen, both created an injurious pit. It's not like the second one added it to where it legally went from an injurious pit to a deadly pit. It started off injury, and now it's even worse of an injury. So why isn't the first one responsible? So we wouldn't have thought that logically, unless the Mishnah said that that's the rule, and the Tana Kamma came to agree. Rebbe says that, in fact, for injury, they both share the cost, and the Chosh and Mishpat even goes further and say if it's only injury, each one pays proportionately to the amount that they dug. Does that make sense? We've got the case clear now. Let's go to the second example of logic brought by Rav Sheshes. Okay? So let's take a case of fire. So Rav Sheshes challenges the Bryce's elucidation of the Mishnah. There's an instance where one adds many bundles of dried twigs to an existing uncontrolled fire, in which case he should be fully and exclusively liable for the damage, even though the fire's owner was also negligent. Why then did the Bryce fail to mention this instance as well? So the Gemara goes according to the same logic as Rav Zera. It's saying, listen, the case is not analogous. Why? So, why? If we say that adding the bundles, if we say that the second person basically, right, adding the bundles created the fire, and that's what created the fire, the second person is fully responsible. But if we say if the second person didn't add to the twigs, etc., it wouldn't have traveled to the neighbor's stack of grain and consumed it, okay, then the first person is not responsible. In other words, the guy that originally created the fire, right, if his fire would have gone to the neighbor and destroyed his stack of grain and consumed it, then the first one's responsible. It didn't matter if somebody added a fire, because the first one would have been enough damage to cause his neighbor's stack of grain to burn. If the second one created a fire and the first one's fire would have burnt out, the second one is solely responsible. They're not both involved in a portion of the damage. Am I making sense, guys?
Just repeat that quickly, Damon. Sorry, just repeat that for...
Okay, so it's exactly the same as the ox. It says, if we say that without adding of the bundles, by this person, the fire would not have traveled and destroyed the neighbor's stack of grain, okay, it is obvious that he and not the fire's owner is liable for damage. Hence, it would be inappropriate for the Brisa to teach this case. And if we say rather that without the intervention, the second person that created the fire would have indeed traveled to the stack of grain and consumed it, what damage did he cause? So this is what it's saying, Kevin. The first guy let his fire get out of control, and it burnt his neighbor's stack of grain. But before that happened, there was a guy that meddled around and made the fire bigger, and it burnt the stack of grain of his neighbor. So they assessed it, and they said that if it would have burnt his neighbor's stack of grain, then the first person that started the fire would be responsible. If the fire would have died out and not reached his neighbor's grain, then the second person is solely responsible. They didn't both contribute to it. Does that make sense? So it can't be like the case of Pitt where somebody added a portion to the damage. It wasn't a combined effort, because either the fire would have gone out on its own, at which case the second one is responsible for having created the fire and giving it new life to damage the neighbor, then the second one is totally responsible. If it's the first one and he didn't need the second person and it would have reached his neighbor's yard, what damage did the second person cause?
Yeah. Okay.
Not fair enough.
Does that make sense, Kev?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So listen, this is where it becomes weird, is because in the case of Pitt, the first digger constructed the majority of what would become the final touches. The second digger only did the final touches to create a lethal pit. So he did 9 tefach of a pit. And the second one did only 1 tefach. So here we don't understand why the first digger is nonetheless exempt. It's according to Rashi. We say, listen, he should be at least 9/10 responsible, at least half responsible. We don't quite understand why the Mishnah and the Tanna Kamma says only the second digger is responsible to create a lethal pit. And we're even more confused because we would have thought like the Rebbe, where it was an injury, they both share the cost equally. And even according to the Choshen Mishpat, it said each one pays proportionately to the effort that they did, according to the total value of damage as a fractional payment. Does that make sense? But for the second digger to be completely responsible for a legal pit, and according to the Mishnah and the Tanna Kamma, to also be responsible entirely for the injurious part is difficult to understand. So that's why Rav Zera and Rav Sheshet is bringing their own logical constructs in the case of different damages. The one brings an ox, the one brings a fire, to try and see if we can have any resolution. So what we're going to do next time is see what happens if you bring a case with regards to the damage of Marve, meaning man, according to Rav Papa. So Rav Papa next time is going to bring the damage according to man. Okay, does this make sense, guys?
Yeah, short time.
Okay, now the Choshen Mishpat, remember it's on page 418 on note 10. Okay? And if you want to see that the second party did more damage than the fourth, remember the first Gemara that it dealt with, it just touched on it here, that it was in 51a in Bava Kamma. So these are just touching on the issues. All right, guys, I want to thank you for a great share. I hope I made sense to you. Do any of you guys have a question? I think we've got a minute left.
4 minutes.
4 minutes. Okay, I don't want to hit the case with Marve with man according to Rav Papa yet. Does anybody have any questions?
It's pretty fascinating. Brilliant.